All right, welcome everyone. Today, we're cracking open a fascinating case file. This is a real medical detective story about a complex autoimmune disease where the body's own defense system, well, it goes rogue. We are diving deep into Sjögren syndrome. So at the very center of this mystery is something called the Sika complex. You can think of this as the primary scene of the crime. It presents as this really profound dryness of the eyes and mouth. And the cause? A targeted attack that's destroying the very glands that are supposed to be making our tears and saliva. Okay, so like any good investigation, our first move is to properly define the condition. Let's start by unpacking the absolute fundamentals of this attack on the body's moisture-producing glands. Clinically, this case can really go one of two ways. First, you've got primary Sjögren's. That's where the condition just shows up all on its own. But then you've got secondary Sjögren's, where it's part of a bigger picture, showing up with other major autoimmune diseases like, say, rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. And now we get to the really juicy part. Who's the perpetrator? Well, here's the classic twist in the story. It's an inside job. The culprit isn't some virus or bacteria from the outside. No, it's the body's own immune system turning against itself with some pretty devastating precision. So how does this betrayal actually happen? This cascade lays it out perfectly. It often kicks off with a trigger, maybe just a common viral infection. This puts our cells under stress, and they start releasing what are called self-antigens. This causes the innate immune system to just freak out, sounding a false alarm. That creates what's called a type 1 interferon signature, a huge hallmark of this disease. This then calls in the heavy hitters of the adaptive immune system, your T and B cells, which swarm into the glands, start pumping out rogue antibodies, and then they carry out the final destructive attack. Okay, so we've established the crime. Now we've got to move into the investigative phase. And just like any detective, we need hard evidence. In medicine, that evidence is found by following the clues left behind in the blood and, crucially, in the tissue itself. So the big question for any diagnostician is, where do you look for the most rock-solid proof? Well, the answer really lies in two key areas: serology, which is just studying the blood, and histopathology, where we're looking at tissue under a microscope. In the blood work, we find our number one person of interest, the anti-Ro/SSA autoantibody. This specific clue turns up in about 70% of cases, which makes it the most common and, frankly, the most sensitive marker we've got. But, one clue is rarely enough to close a case. So we built a full immunological fingerprint by looking for its accomplices, things like ANA and rheumatoid factor. And pay attention to this last one. Low complement levels, C3 and C4, that's not just another piece of evidence. It's a critical red flag for a much more dangerous threat later on. Now, blood tests are vital, don't get me wrong, but the single most powerful piece of evidence, the real smoking gun, is found right at the scene of the crime. By taking a tiny piece of a minor salivary gland, usually from the lower lip, and putting it under a microscope, we can literally witness the attack firsthand. And what exactly are we looking for? This right here, focal lymphocytic sialadenitis, or FLS for short. It's just a technical term for these dense, organized clusters of at least 50 immune cells, lymphocytes, all huddled together. This isn't just circumstantial evidence. This is direct proof of the immune system's invasion. Now, to make the evidence completely airtight, pathologists use a specific calculation. It's called the Vocus score. See, it's not enough to just see the cells hanging around. To meet the gold standard, they have to find at least one of these dense clusters, one focus, within a 4 square millimeter patch of gland tissue. A focus score of 1 or higher is what you're looking for. So we've gathered all the evidence from the blood, from the tissue. How do clinicians actually reach a final verdict? Well, they use a standardized points-based system to weigh everything as objectively as possible. And this system basically separates the evidence into two camps. You've got your heavyweights, which are worth 3 points each. That's our smoking gun biopsy and that key anti-Ro blood test. Then you have the lightweights, worth 1 point each, which are more the clinical tests for things like eye dryness and saliva flow. So here's the deal. All of these pieces get added up to reach a target score. And that magic number, the number that officially confirms the diagnosis of Sjögren syndrome, is 4. And this just brilliantly shows you the power of that heavyweight evidence. Check this out. If you have a positive biopsy, that's 3 points. And you have a positive anti-Ro blood test, that's another 3 points. You got a total of 6 points. That's way more than you need, instantly solving the case on what everyone calls the fast track. But hold on, our investigation doesn't just stop with a diagnosis. The impact of this inside job isn't only about dry eyes and a dry mouth. We have to look beyond the glands to really grasp the full scope of this disease and its most serious threats.
So that same infiltration of lymphocytes we see in the salivary glands, it can happen in other major organs too. This leads to what are called extraglandular manifestations, and they can affect the lungs, the kidneys, the skin, even the nervous system. It makes Sjögren's a truly systemic disease.
And that brings us to the most critical long-term threat. Over a lifetime, patients with Sjögren syndrome have a 5 to 10% risk of developing a specific cancer called B-cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma. This is an absolutely vital piece of the puzzle. So why does this happen? Well, that constant, chronic activation of the immune system's B cells can eventually just push them over the edge, causing them to grow out of control and become malignant. Clinicians are always on high alert for the risk signs, like swollen glands that just won't go down, those low C4 levels we talked about, and some very specific findings on a biopsy. Finally, no investigation is complete until you've checked out other possibilities, right? A huge part of diagnosis is lining up the usual suspects, other conditions that can look a lot like Sjögren's, and ruling them out one by one. This matrix here is an absolutely essential tool. It helps pathologists tell the difference between Sjögren's and its main lookalikes. For instance, IgG4-related disease has a totally different type of cell and this unique scarring pattern called storiform fibrosis. Sarcoidosis, on the other hand, is defined by these clumps of cells called granulomas. Each one has its own distinct signature under the microscope.
So to wrap up our case, let's lock in these 4 key diagnostic anchors. Remember the fast track to diagnosis, biopsy plus anti-Ro. Never forget the urgent threat of lymphoma. And always be on the lookout for the mimics, the great deceiver, IgG4-related disease, and the clinical trap, which is sarcoidosis.
This case really shows us just how incredibly complex an autoimmune disease can be. It is a true inside job, where the body's protectors become its attackers. And that leaves us with one final crucial question. What's the next frontier in really truly understanding, and maybe one day even solving, these deep mysteries of autoimmunity?